Today, the southeast corner of East 40th Street and East 40th Street and Prospect is a surface parking lot, unless it's changed in the last few weeks and I'm not aware of it. A surface parking lot that's very well maintained, but it wasn't always just a surface parking lot. I remember it when Ruthie and Moe's Diner was there. A great place in the Midtown. It was a place where folks from all over the city would, from time to time, just show up for breakfast or lunch, and it was a place that was so eclectic in the gathering of people. Not all the gatherings were planned, but people would come there and you'd see them and there would be spontaneous conversation. And it was so enjoyable most of the time. The food was pretty good too. I always liked the matzo ball soup and ordered 2 matzo balls all the time. It was a great place, and it's now a surface parking lot. Maybe that's a parable, but that's another sermon. One morning, I was there for breakfast, early in the morning, and I went into Ruthie and Moe's, and sitting at the end of the counter, the breakfast counter, all by herself, which was unusual. This is in 1993 now. That's a few weeks ago. In 1993, in the early spring, sitting by herself that morning at breakfast was Stephanie Tubbs Jones. I recognized her then. She was a judge of the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. These were a number of years before she ran for county prosecutor and then became the congresswoman from the 11th District following Lou Stokes. But she was always a high-energy profile person in our community. So Stephanie sitting alone was unusual, but it was an opportunity for me, being my bashful self. I went over and just greeted her and reminded her that I was the pastor of then First Church Cleveland at East 30th and Euclid, and that I had heard her speak on several settings, particularly when I was involved in Leadership Cleveland in the class of 91, yada, 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 yada. But what was amazing is that Stephanie, in her engaging way, involved me in a conversation with her spontaneously about spiritual life. Figuring I was a pastor perhaps and that the conversation might be safe, she started to talk to me about her growing up time in Cleveland and her long involvement in Bethany Baptist Church on East 107th. Where as a child she was in that congregation and where she still found great support and community. The conversation with her about those things was inspiring to me. It gave me a sense of energy just to talk about how a person in her situation particularly related her spiritual life to then her work as a judge on the Court of Common Pleas. I was touched by the conversation, and so at the end, I asked her if she would come to First Church Cleveland on a Sunday morning and from the pulpit give that testimony. And she agreed. So months passed and the Sunday came that we had agreed that would work out, and she came to First Church and she gave, in the fall then of 1993, her testimony about her spiritual life and journey, and related that to life as she was experiencing it. It was an inspiring time, and she was so well received by the congregation. I thought. And she was, for the most part. There were no politics in the sermon. There were, in the expression of her witness, there was just the joy of affirming spiritual life and its impact on us and its importance in how we live our lives. About 2.5 weeks later, a small group of people made an appointment and came to see me. They announced themselves, people I loved and cared about, but they announced themselves in the encounter in those days as a delegation speaking for a number of others. And they were very concerned, legitimately in their mind, very concerned that I had invited a politician to speak in a worship experience, and that her testimony was out of place. What spoke louder to them was her identification with a particular political party, although she was running for nothing at that time. Her involvement as a judge didn't really matter, and what she said went right over their head because her party and all the things that they attributed to her political situation by the virtue of definition caused them not to hear anything about spiritual power and excitement and vitality and hopefulness. And so several of the folks in the group, again, who I loved and cared about, and it was a painful time when they said, "You know, Ken, we're going to look for another church." Because we think there needs to be equal time. Equal time for what? What equal time is there for a point of view of no spiritual life? What time is there for an expression of frustration or an expression that spiritual life really doesn't matter, that our party speaks louder? Where's equal time for that? Anyway, hold that story in your mind for just a minute and go forward a number of years now. In 2017, President Trump named as his Secretary of Defense James Mad Dog Mattis, a very fine general who had experience serving in the military from the days of Vietnam, personal involvement in infantry and the Marines and all that, with a stellar history of leading men and women. An involvement that led to higher and higher positions until finally he was a decorated general. An involvement then with a number of United States presidents. When he was named to be Secretary of Defense, a guy by the name of Filkins interviewed him in an extensive interview and asked him in the course of an interview that wound up in the New Yorker magazine in 2017 about James Mattis, about what he anticipated and expected in his position and what would go on. And of course, Mattis responded with his global perspective and his involvement in many issues and the difficult situations in Iran and Iraq and North Korea and all the hot, difficult places, the incursions of the Russians in different areas of the world. On and on and on. But then finally, Filkins asked him, and here's why I hope this relates. Said to him, Secretary Mattis, as you begin your work as Secretary of Defense, what keeps you up at night? What causes you to lose sleep? There was no immediate answer. And Mattis became, according to the article, reflective. And Filkins expected, he's going to talk to me about North Korea. He's going to talk to me about terrorism or ISIS. But then Mattis responded and said, you know what I really fear is what's happening in our country. We are such a divided people. Now imagine these words. Mattis said, I am concerned about the spiritual alienation in our country that I cannot explain. A spiritual alienation that is driving us from community and causing us, now hear this, causing us to be unable to have a fundamental friendliness for each other. Think about that. That's almost church words. We would call it perhaps koinonia or community, or living in the community of agape. Or if we were in the Jewish tradition, we might speak of hesed, steadfast love. Not some myopic, candy-coated emotion, but a relationship of fundamental friendliness as a result of spiritual vitality. And we lack it when it happens that we have a spiritual crisis. According to Mattis, we all break down. And that's what concerns him. Now, those two vignettes from my experience with Stephanie Tubbs Jones in the pulpit at First Church all those years ago, and the reaction of a few, and then the comments by General Mattis form in part, I think, a background for understanding this difficult on the surface reading Scripture, where Jesus is speaking to the disciples about the end of the world. You see, in Jesus' time, all of us' time is Jesus' time, but in the time of his physical life, Palestine, Israel, was a place where it lacked fundamental friendliness. There was a spiritual crisis, and people were drawn off in camps, political and religious, many of the times the political camps fueled by a particular religious perspective, and people were at each other, with the masses of folks being so disenchanted with all of it that they just decided, hey, secularization is better. We won't pay any attention to that stuff. And there was no expression of spirit among many. There was no expression of a faithfulness to anything in particular except one's party or one's affiliation with a party that was fueled by a religious fervor. And in that fervor, the common thing was that people were arguing about the end of the world. That if you believed in the right things, the end of the world was going to come, and thank God. All of us righteous folks, we are going to be among the saved group, and everybody else, the heathen world and all these occupiers in our nation, all these other folks, they're just going to get their backside burned. And we can rejoice in it. There was this self-righteousness that had just cut the spirit out of people. And in its place was this lack of fundamental friendliness. And so imagine this. The disciples who have Jesus in their presence, the only thing they can think about to ask him is, when's the world going to end, Jesus? Give us the date. Tell us the time. You're connected. Tell us when the end is going to come so we can get all ready and really happy that finally we're going to be saved. And Jesus says to them, you guys are thinking way beyond your pay grade. I don't know when the end is going to come, and only the Father does, and your understanding of when the end comes is all messed up anyway. You won't find that in the text. These are a bit of my embellishments. You don't know the day or the hour. And it's pretty doggone useless for you to think about it, because it's irrelevant to what the kingdom is about. We're all going to live our lives, and it's going to be in the days like the days of Noah. People are just marrying and giving in marriage, or living their lives, or doing their thing, and suddenly things change. But you can't base your life now on some kind of expectation that you are blessed and others are damned. And then Jesus says, we don't know the hour, so what do you do when you don't know the hour? Well, you don't worry about that. Put your mind on the most important thing, which is, are you spiritually awake? Are you living with a sense of spiritual vitality that enables you to see the world as a blessing? Are you living with a life that is so spiritually active that even in the midst of despair and destruction and hopelessness and the mean-spirited things that some people do, can you live your life in such a way that you are spiritually awake and you live with a sense of excitement and expectation and a willingness to keep at it with an attitude? Now, these aren't, he said it in his way, but live your life in such a way as that you promote a fundamental friendliness in a world of brokenheartedness. Stay awake. Can you imagine what happens, though? Across the generations, how do we interpret things? We always fall into the similar repetition of history where we want to say, oh, here's the saved group, and I'm in it. And everybody else. And then you describe the everybody else with the categories and criteria that your prejudices support. But Jesus says, stay awake, have a different attitude, a spiritual presence of vitality and hopefulness. Well, my friends, just as people have in every generation, we live in a time where it's, I think, not easy, but it is not ununderstandable that folks get sucked into the idea of being unfriendly even in the name of God. So you have some folk, just like 2,000 years ago, whose religious perspective fuels their politics. And they decide that they're so important that they can take the life of others in the name of some terrible, sick perspective on the Creator. Well, we live in a time of a lack of fundamental friendliness. And we wonder why there are stabbings on the London Bridge or shootings that seem to come unceasing in our country. And folks run around and scramble, as we do, first responders who do a great job, all of that. But how many times do you hear, we got to figure out a motive? What will that do? The motive is what's always been the motive. It's when self is so lifted up that the self perspective matters more than anybody else. It is a spiritual crisis. And we lack a fundamental friendliness. And a number of people feel good about it. Because I'm on the right path. Now, how do we figure all this out? And we can't. But how do we have some sense of what we need to be about? And I'd like to share this with you. 4 weeks ago now, maybe 3, I had grandpa time with my granddaughter, Adeline Grace, who's now 7 years old, and she has become my spiritual muse. We were together, just the two of us, and she's wanted to play school. And Addie was the teacher, and I was the student. And I sat in my place, and she set up a white board, and she was going to lead the class in solving addition problems. So she said, now, Grandpa, you have got to be aware of rule number 1. Grandpa, rule number 1 is, in class, if you have an answer or you want to talk, you raise your hand, but don't speak until I call on you. This is rule number 1, Grandpa. You don't speak unless the teacher calls on you. Okay, Addie, I got it. So she starts putting the addition problems on the whiteboard, and it's 6 plus 2. And I shoot up my hand, but I couldn't stop from answering, Addie, or teacher, 8. And she goes, Grandpa, you have broken rule number 1. You don't speak until I call on you. So it goes on, I got it, and I'll try and be better teacher. And she puts up some more addition problems, but finally she comes to another one, and I shoot up my hand and I blurt out the answer. And she goes, Grandpa, that's twice that you have broken rule number 1. You don't speak until I call on you. Here it is. She says to me, Grandpa, if it happens again, I'm going to have to call your parents. I have relished in that. Is it not the case, my friends, that we are losing a sense of higher authority? A higher authority that is loving, that cares for us completely, that seeks our good, that has created in us a life that is purposeful and purpose-filled, and that we are living in response to that gift of that higher authority. And we live in such a way as that we know we're accountable for returning on God's investment in us some sense of the Creator that is kind and decent and good and filled with love, or what maybe Mattis might have said is a fundamental friendliness. And when we get out of line or we forget rule number 1, we speak out of turn, we put ourselves forward, we jump ahead of a line, we determine that somehow we are the most important of things, and we forget a higher authority. A higher authority that does not seek to damn us, but that in some kind of great, eternal, parental, creative love expects that we are a part of a community in regard for one another. This is why, among other things, the candles of Advent are so important this season, to think about it and take it in for a spiritual renewal. Because it engenders in us, if we understand we are responsible to a higher authority ultimately, and that the authority is loving and seeks our good, and creates in us, as a result, a sense of humility and a regard for other human beings. We live in that fundamental friendliness. That's what this message of Advent and Christmas is about. That God comes into the world, and there in a little manger, in a humble place, where nobody expects anything of importance, is the message that God is among us in such a way as to give us a life, or create in us a life, encourage in us a life of purpose and power and passion and regard and a humble perspective on the world, rather than sticking out our hands and shooting off our mouth without being called on. appealing to a higher authority, a communion of saints, parents who've gone on before us, grandparents, ancestors, people of the great community of faith, that we're a part of something that doesn't stop. And that it's wonderful. And as a result of that spiritual renewal and that vitality, we can live in our world, as difficult as our world can sometimes be, with that sense of resilience and hope and a spiritual attitude that promotes fundamental friendliness with one another. And we seek to draw each other in rather than cast each other out. Thanks be to God, I'm done. Amen.
Thanks for watching our video. Make sure to subscribe to get the latest and greatest videos from the Old Stone Church. And if you feel blessed by our message, please go to theoldstonechurch.org and click Donate. God bless you today and forever. The Old Stone Church. We've been loving Christ and serving City since 1820.